all about?
Yeah, well, apart from the people who are just into Ravi.
There's been a surprising revelation about George Harrison, famously referred to as the Quiet Beatle. Although he gained admiration for his spiritual nature and profound love of music, Harrison was also known for his unfiltered honesty, sometimes brutally so. Unlike his former bandmates, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, who usually chose to express criticism in a diplomatic manner, George never hesitated to voice his disdain, especially when it came to artists he didn't hold in high regard. "You once said the Beatles were a curse to you. Are you saying the same thing again now?" someone asked him. His answer reflected the burden he carried. The legacy of the Beatles continued to haunt him and others long after the band's era had ended. So who were the artists George Harrison had the harshest opinions about? Let's dive into some of his most biting critiques. Neil Young. In a candid 1992 interview with Bob Goff, George Harrison made it clear that he had no fondness for Neil Young. When the topic of Young's music came up, Harrison didn't mince words, declaring bluntly, "I hate it. Yeah, I can't stand it. I'm not a Young fan." And his comments didn't stop there. He was especially dismissive of Young's guitar skills, describing them as clumsy and lacking polish. Having played alongside some of rock's most revered musicians, Harrison couldn't wrap his head around Young's style. He even found it laughable. He recalled a moment during a shared performance when he and Eric Clapton exchanged stunned looks, while Young delivered a particularly bewildering guitar solo. "I hate his playing. It's good for a laugh. We did the show with him, and I watched from the side of the stage. I looked at Eric Clapton and said, 'What's going on?' He did a solo in the middle and just kind of looked at me like, 'Don't look at me. It's not me.'" That story perfectly encapsulated Harrison's disbelief over what he saw as Young's chaotic and unrefined technique. One track that especially grated on Harrison's nerves was Young's song "Around the World." When asked for his opinion on it, he responded without hesitation, "I can't stand it." Considering Young's reputation for pushing musical boundaries and embracing unconventional sounds, it's likely that Harrison found his approach jarring, especially when compared to the melodic sophistication that the Beatles were known for. Still, despite George Harrison's open contempt, Neil Young never returned the criticism. In fact, he maintained a deep respect for the Beatles, often crediting them as a major influence on his own career. Rising to prominence in the 1960s and becoming a cornerstone of both folk and classic rock, Young consistently praised the Beatles' creativity and songwriting. He never responded with hostility to Harrison's words, continuing instead to honor their legacy. Harrison's opinion of Neil Young also speaks to a larger debate among music lovers and critics. Young's guitar playing has always been polarizing, described by some as raw and emotionally charged, and by others as noisy and rough around the edges. While many fans see his work as authentic and deeply expressive, purists like Harrison saw it as lacking the finesse and structure that define timeless music. Oasis. Plenty of legendary rockers have expressed dislike for Oasis, but few did it with the cutting sharpness of George Harrison. As a former member of the very band that Oasis idolized most, Harrison's words carried serious weight. The Beatles were a foundational influence on Noel Gallagher, the band's main songwriter, who never hid his admiration for their legacy. But that respect was not mutual. In 1996, at a time when Oasis was dominating the charts thanks to their hit album What's the Story Morning Glory, George Harrison issued a ruthless assessment of the band. Despite their meteoric rise and frequent comparisons to the Beatles, Harrison was unimpressed. Speaking candidly, he said, "The music lacks depth, and the singer Liam is a pain. The rest of the band don't mean anything." That remark was a dagger to the heart of Oasis's reputation. Harrison's critique painted a picture of a band that he viewed as all swagger and no substance. While Oasis was beloved for their catchy choruses and bold attitude, Harrison clearly believed they were missing the artistic depth and nuance that separates great music from generic hits. His attack on Liam Gallagher, calling him a pain, suggested that he saw the frontman's larger-than-life persona as a distraction rather than an asset. For Liam Gallagher, the insult was unforgivable. Known for his fiery temper and confrontational attitude, Liam didn't take kindly to being dismissed by a Beatles legend. Rather than turning the other cheek, he threatened to physically confront Harrison, making it clear that he didn't value the older musician's opinion. His reaction only served to reinforce Harrison's point. He came across exactly as the outspoken and reckless figure George had described. But Harrison's comments weren't just a personal jab. They echoed a sentiment shared by some veterans of the rock world who viewed Oasis as more imitation than innovation. The Gallagher brothers often declared the Beatles as their biggest influence, but critics like Harrison felt the band borrowed heavily without adding anything original. By calling the rest of the band meaningless, Harrison seemed to imply that Oasis was driven more by hype and media buzz than actual talent. Even in the face of Harrison's harsh words, Oasis continued to flourish through the late 1990s. Noel Gallagher, in contrast to his brother, remained respectful toward the Beatles and frequently discussed how their music shaped his own. He avoided engaging in any personal drama, choosing instead to stay focused on his admiration for their artistry. Liam, on the other hand, remained defiant, continuing to embrace the image of a rebellious rock star who refused to be swayed by criticism, no matter who it came from. While Harrison's scathing remarks may have stung, the success of Oasis proved they had a powerful connection with fans. Even if their sound didn't meet George Harrison's standards for musical sophistication, there's no denying their impact on British rock history. In the end, the brief clash between George Harrison and Liam Gallagher symbolized a deeper generational rift, one between the classic rock icons of the past and the bold, brash voices of the 90s who saw themselves as the rightful heirs to rock and roll's legacy. Elton John. Although George Harrison had personal respect for Elton John, that never stopped him from being candid about his thoughts on music, even when it meant offering criticism towards some of the most celebrated artists of his time. While Harrison acknowledged John's overwhelming popularity and undeniable talent, he often felt that his music lacked true originality and emotional depth. Throughout his life, Harrison was known for pushing musical boundaries, both during his time with the Beatles and in his solo career. From his perspective, Elton John's work leaned too heavily on tried and tested formulas, failing to deliver the kind of innovation Harrison deeply valued in music. In a 1976 interview with India Today, Harrison did not hold back. He admitted that while he appreciated John's ability as a performer and songwriter, he struggled to connect with his music on a personal level. Instead, Harrison revealed his strong admiration for the early rock and roll trailblazers who helped shape the Beatles' sound. Artists such as Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Carl Perkins. These legendary musicians, in Harrison's eyes, represented a raw, trailblazing authenticity that he felt was missing from Elton John's body of work. He described John's music as overly repetitive and formulaic, suggesting that while it may have topped the charts, it did not possess the artistic richness or evolution he held in high regard. Harrison's critique seemed rooted in his own deeply spiritual and introspective musical path. He spent much of his post-Beatles career seeking greater meaning, often incorporating Indian classical influences, complex musical arrangements, and profound lyrical themes into his albums. His solo masterpiece, All Things Must Pass, is a prime example of this journey. In comparison, Elton John's more theatrical and pop-oriented style, though brilliantly executed, struck Harrison as safe and lacking the adventurous spirit he championed. Yet, it's crucial to understand that Harrison's opinion was never fueled by animosity. Unlike the disdain he showed for figures such as Neil Young or the members of Oasis, Harrison maintained a respectful tone when speaking about Elton John. He saw him as a talented entertainer and admired his professional success. He simply didn't resonate with his musical output. Despite their artistic differences, Harrison and John never allowed critique to escalate into a public rivalry. Known for his resilience and self-confidence, Elton John appeared unfazed by Harrison's remarks. In fact, their relationship remained amicable over the years. John continued to speak highly of the Beatles and often expressed his deep admiration for their revolutionary role in shaping the history of rock music. Despite both the Hollies and the Beatles emerging from the Merseyside music scene, their connection was far from a friendly hometown alliance. Rather than bonding over shared roots, their rivalry played out with the intensity of two fiercely competitive football clubs. A major turning point in their strained relationship occurred in 1965, when the Hollies released a cover of George Harrison's If I Needed Someone, originally featured on Rubber Soul. Instead of feeling flattered, Harrison reacted with anger, believing the band had completely misunderstood the essence of his work. The issue escalated when the Hollies released their version of If I Needed Someone as a single, on the exact same day Rubber Soul hit store shelves in December 1965. At the time, the Hollies were riding high as one of Britain's most dependable and successful pop groups. Their clean vocal harmonies and slick production had earned them multiple chart-topping hits, but their polished, radio-friendly style stood in stark contrast to the increasingly experimental direction the Beatles were exploring. Tensions flared during one of the Beatles' final UK tours, when journalist Alan Smith from New Musical Express brought up the new Hollies single in a backstage interview. According to Smith, the mention of the song sparked a surprising reaction from Harrison. "I was asking him about his songwriting," Smith recalled. "I said, 'I see you've written one for the Hollies.'" At that, George turned abruptly from the mirror and replied sharply, "Tell people I didn't write it for the Hollies." His tone left no room for misinterpretation. Harrison was clearly displeased. He wanted to set the record straight. The Hollies had not been handpicked to cover his song, nor had they received his blessing. His criticism didn't end there. Speaking with open disdain, he said, "It's called If I Needed Someone, and they've released it as their new single. But their version isn't my kind of music. I think it's rubbish the way they've done it. They've ruined it." This was a particularly harsh statement, especially coming from a fellow British rock musician. Harrison's main complaint seemed to center around how the Hollies had stripped the song of its emotional depth, turning it into something impersonal and disconnected. His criticism extended beyond the cover itself. He also took a shot at their overall sound and approach to music. "The Hollies are musically fine," he said, "but the way they record, they sound like a bunch of session players who just met up in a studio without ever really connecting." With that comment, Harrison suggested that the Hollies lacked the authentic synergy and creative spark that he felt defined the Beatles. Their music, to him, came across as too mechanical, too calculated, void of the raw energy and emotional depth that made a band truly special. This was a scathing critique, particularly because the Hollies were widely praised for their vocal harmony and production quality, elements that had brought them widespread popularity. But none of that seemed to impress Harrison. His words caused a stir and solidified the rift between the two groups. It became yet another illustration of how competitive and emotionally charged the British rock scene was during the 1960s. While the Beatles were embracing more adventurous, boundary-pushing music, the Hollies remained firmly planted in mainstream pop. That artistic divide likely fed into Harrison's dismissive reaction. Though Harrison's response was biting, the Hollies continued to enjoy success into the late 1960s and beyond. Still, the episode marked a clear line of separation between the two bands. In Harrison's eyes, the Hollies were not his equals. He viewed them as a lesser act, one that lacked the innovation and artistic soul he believed was crucial to great music. Their rivalry never devolved into open hostility, but Harrison's scorn left a deep impression. Being labeled rubbish by a Beatle was a painful blow, especially coming from someone they had once admired. But for Harrison, this was just another instance of his brutal honesty. He always said what he thought, even if it didn't earn him many friends in the industry. Bee Gees, another musical group that drew George Harrison's disdain, was none other than the Bee Gees, especially during the height of their disco fame. As disco exploded in popularity in the late 1970s, Harrison, a staunch believer in authenticity and spiritual depth in music, saw the genre as overly commercial and shallow. And since no group was more closely tied to disco than the Bee Gees, they became a natural target of his criticism. Harrison's contempt for disco stemmed from his lifelong preference for music that conveyed raw emotion and artistic sincerity. His influences ranged from early rock and roll to Indian classical music and Western folk traditions. These diverse sounds shaped his work both with the Beatles and as a solo artist. He admired musicians who used their songs as a vehicle for personal reflection and spiritual exploration. In contrast, he saw disco as a genre built for the dance floor, more style than substance. The Bee Gees, as the defining act of the disco era, embodied many of the trends in pop that Harrison found troubling. While the Gibb brothers began their careers in the 1960s, writing introspective soft rock ballads like "To Love Somebody in Massachusetts," their shift to disco in the mid-1970s catapulted them to superstardom. Hits like "Stayin' Alive," "Night Fever," and "You Should Be Dancing" became cultural milestones of the Saturday Night Fever era. But to Harrison, this transformation symbolized everything that was going wrong in music. To him, the Bee Gees' disco output was a clear example of music sacrificing depth for commercial success. With its repetitive beats, falsetto vocals, and overproduced arrangements, disco seemed to lack the emotional resonance and narrative weight that Harrison valued. Unlike the music he cherished, songs that spoke to human experience and spiritual growth, disco felt manufactured, flashy, and ultimately hollow. His dislike of disco also reflected a broader distrust of the music industry. Harrison had long criticized record executives for prioritizing profits over artistry. In his eyes, the disco craze confirmed this fear. It wasn't about musicians expressing themselves. It was about selling records and dominating the charts. The rise of disco only strengthened his belief that true creativity was being crushed by commercial pressures. That said, Harrison's criticism was likely aimed more at the genre than at the Bee Gees as individuals. He recognized their talent. They had written numerous hit songs across multiple genres, but their link to disco made them an easy target for a musician like Harrison, who had no patience for what he saw as empty trends. Even as Harrison voiced his disapproval, the Bee Gees and disco remained enormously successful through the late 1970s. Yet by the early 1980s, public opinion shifted, and the genre began to fade. The Bee Gees eventually moved away from disco and returned to writing for other artists, reconnecting with their roots as songwriters. Through it all, George Harrison stayed true to his own musical path. The rise and fall of disco never altered his approach. He continued making music rooted in personal and spiritual exploration, with no interest in chasing trends. His disdain for the Bee Gees and disco was just one facet of his larger philosophy. Music should speak to something deeper than just entertainment. It should offer meaning. It should feel real. So, what's your take? Do you agree with George Harrison's opinion about these artists? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Goodbye.